disadvantages that students might face or bring with them in terms of their histories into higher education, and there are actually some really significant differential outcomes for particular sorts of students. So belonging has for some time now been framed as a way to think about how we work with students to shape retention, but actually most of the what works literature, whilst it's very good, doesn't look at particular sorts of students. It's quite homogenised ways of thinking about belonging. And there's very little research that looks at belongingness and black and minoritised ethnic students. I did a big comprehensive literature review for another university, which will get published later this year. And we looked across the UK, the States and Europe, and there's almost no evidence of interventions where you can actually claim an empirical evidence base for the things that actually happen. So we don't really know what works for certain groups of students. But we definitely do know that students who are not white are much more likely to drop out of higher education. So the focus for this presentation is on black and minoritised ethnic students, and I use that term deliberately. I don't think BME is a particularly helpful term. It's very reductionist, and also, of course, in some universities, students from ethnic minority backgrounds are the majority, so they're not an ethnic minority, but they are minoritised by the practices and policies of those institutions, and I think they're minoritised when they're in the minority as well. So I'm going to focus on students, as I say, who maybe have come in with more complex trajectories into higher education, so they're listed there. But I'm also alert to the sort of intersectionality here. So some of this, there is an intersectional relationship between ethnic minority students and socioeconomic background, gender, etc., etc. And one of the things that's come out, obviously, out of the Muslim research is that there is no such thing as Muslim. There are multiple Muslim identities, and it's the same, obviously, for ethnic minority students. The problem is, in most of the data, it becomes homogenised because the numbers are quite low in lots of different places, and that's another reason why it's actually quite difficult to think about categorically what might work for particular communities. So what I'm doing here is looking across a data set that's come together from a number of different projects, and there's about 60 or so quite lengthy biographical and storytelling narratives that I'm looking across that data to think about students' academic and social experiences of being on campus and how that shapes their sense of belonging and mattering. And I'm going to look at belonging and mattering differently, although they're very closely connected, and then to think about how we might affect change. You'll be pleased to know that none of these interviews took place in your own institutions, so that's good. So when you look at the appalling things that people are saying, you can at least think, they weren't my students, so that's quite nice. Actually, none of them were at Sheffield Hallam as well, so that's quite useful, so I can say what I like, really. So some of the data was collected specifically to projects looking at belonging and mattering, and they've looked at more than students from black and minoritised ethnic backgrounds, so they might have looked across different religions or different other social affiliations. And some of them were some of them are broader and some of them are specific. And this first part of the presentation, I've used May's work around everyday belongingness and sort of belongingness and social relationships to think about what people are saying about belonging on campus and what that means to them. And it's not a particularly positive picture, I have to say. So, belonging, it's a multifaceted concept. It's quite slippery and quite hard to pin down. But it's, I suppose, in its simplest term, it's about how whether we do or don't feel connected to place, space, and those around us. And there's something quite active involved in belonging. But I think you can feel a sense of belonging on a relatively passive level. When I start to talk about mattering, I think one of the differences between belonging and mattering is that there's a much more affective, interrelational, two-way process of connection when we start to think about how we matter than potentially there is in belonging. But nonetheless, it's about that process of how we create connections with other people within particular spaces, and it shapes how we think about who we are in the world. And in terms of higher education, the importance of belonging is not because it just has a direct implication for retention, but because people who belong are able to make claims about their entitlement to be in higher education over people who don't belong, who start to believe that they don't have the right to be there. So belongingness has a direct connection with whether we feel that we're entitled to be in higher education. And that's where there's another link with obviously with retention. So thinking about everyday belonging, what the students were talking about, it particularly comes down to staff and student relationships and where those work and they don't, student-student relationships, academic practices and broader campus relationships. And what May argues is that we really only know we don't belong when we don't belong. So if we don't think about belonging, it's probably because we do belong. And if we can go about our everyday lives without people drawing attention to our entitlement to be in those spaces or doing those things, we're probably okay. But it would only be when something significant happened that we might start to think about the fact that we don't belong in that particular space. What I found with these students is that there were real power relationships going on which fundamentally affected their belief about their entitlement to be in a particular space and that sense of belonging. The everydayness of the world was not a simple, straightforward one for these students. It was deeply problematic in all sorts of ways. And there were real tensions between the ordinary and the extraordinary in ways in which for the rest of us should have been quite ordinary but actually became quite extraordinary for these students. So I'm just going to put the quotes up. I'm not going to read them out unless there's anybody who perhaps would need them read out. So I'll just allow you to read them, but do say if you think you'd rather I did read them out. So one of the things here that came up over and over again was, first of all, the justification about having to continually justify your right to be in a particular space. And then secondly, for those people who, either because of the colour of their skin or because of the clothing that they chose to wear as part of their faith particularly, but also their cultural identity, that created a significant barrier in terms of their ease through which they moved through space and time on campus. There was a real problem with a lack of understanding of the difference between home UK students and international students, and it comes up over and over again. And in fact, it's come up again in my own institution when we've been running in the event for Muslim students next week, when we've started to ask to talk to people about Muslims, and they immediately say, oh, you need the international office for that. So there's almost no sense that you can be Muslim and a home student, which obviously is ridiculous. But that subtle power relationship between people asking people to justify their right to be somewhere happened over and over again. But what was particularly worrying for me in looking at the research and talking to the students is it became normalised for them. This is just how the world is. This is not how the world is for white students, but this is how the world is for these students. And after a while, that there was either that sense of just giving up or just accepting this is how the world is. And they also experienced the world as incredibly problematic in quite small ways. Muslim students in particular, unsurprisingly perhaps at the moment, are treated with a level of suspicion that no other group has to be the recipient of. Female students from different ethnic groups also find it particularly difficult to not have to keep justifying what to them are very ordinary practices. So clothing again became deeply problematic for some of these students. But also, again, this idea that help is available for international students, but if you don't fall into that classification, you should somehow just know what you're doing. So those small problems just became repeated over and over and over again. Now, of course, there'll be other students for whom this might also be their reality. This is not to say that these things are just problems for students from black and minoritized ethnic backgrounds, but they're compounded because they happen over and over again. They're persistent, they're entrenched, and they're dealing with really quite racist practices. The practices that for other people might be a problem, for these students, they're both racist and perceived as being racist. And I will I get frustrated by the sector's unwillingness to claim as racist some of the practices of higher education. And I think one of the things that I would say we need to do is to use that term when it's appropriate, and a lot of the time it is. And the other thing for these students, again, is the sort of the extraordinary in the ordinary. So the first student there, that singling out of things like accent over and over again for students, what they wear, and again, the discourse around terrorism is really pervasive. So in those particular instances, you've got really ordinary things going on. You've got a student carrying a rucksack, you've got a woman just wearing what she wants to wear, and you've got somebody on placement. For everybody else, those are ordinary activities, but they perpetually become extraordinarised. I don't think that's a word, actually, but I'm making it up. I'm claiming that word. It's my word. So why does it matter? And it's because what actually happens with these students is they start to see themselves as less socially significant than others. That continually framing of them as the other, through the very small micro practices of higher education, positions them in ways that make them stand out as not fitting in. So it's not that these students are unable to find a sense of belonging, but actually they're positioned in ways that makes it impossible for that to happen. What's happening with the students as well is they're constantly having to contest the belongingness and to continually reframe ways in which they're seeking to claim that they belong, and they're constantly being positioned by others as not belonging and not fitting in. Other people draw boundaries around them all the time, so they're always being framed and put into different places. And because of that, they're having to create these sort of multiple belongings in lots of different circumstances over and over and over again. And I think that was one of the things that came out most starkly from the data for me, is that for most students coming into higher education, it might be problematic and it might be difficult to actually start to settle in. But once you're in, and once you feel that sense of belonging, it just pretty much continues. For these students, that's renegotiated every day. And that's the problem, that we need to really challenge some of the what works literature, because I don't think it recognises the ways in which this continually happens over time. And of course it has significant implications for how students think about themselves. So first of all, these students that I talked to saw these racist practices as quite ordinary. They'd internalised them as being just how the world was, and they had to accept it. And because of that, there were implications for how they thought about themselves in relationship to other people. It shaped their sense of identity, their sense of self-esteem, their sense of self-worth. And because of that, they started to internalise the idea that they weren't the rightful inheritors of higher education, but actually they were people who were never going to succeed in the same ways. And I think it's got direct implications for why students choose to drop out, but also why they potentially then don't do as well as they should do. Because this internalisation of not being as good as other people is bound in the end to make you have that sort of almost self-fulfilling prophecy of not thinking that you're good enough, and therefore performing in ways potentially where you don't become good enough. Part of this research was conducted across 2 Russell Group universities. I've not drawn on most of the data because there was actually a separate set of 70 interviews with students there. And it was really quite interesting because all universities have a degree attainment gap between white students and non-white students. Slightly better in the Russell Group, but they still do have a gap. So we were asked to go in and actually talk to students from different ethnic groups about their experiences of working with each other academically, working with staff academically, and how they approach their academic studies. And what was really interesting in that data was that we had a group of white students, so we ran discussion groups in separate ethnic groups because we wanted to listen to what students might have to say in a safe space, potentially. But also we were interested in seeing whether that picked up any differences. And what came out of that data there was a huge sense of entitlement of white students to be in higher education. Now, there was a strong link with social class here. This is not just about ethnicity. But those students didn't doubt their entitlement to be there. And because of that, they didn't doubt their entitlement to actually go and ask for academic support. And because they felt entitled to go and ask for academic support, they demanded academic support. So they weren't just thinking they might find a way of knowing why they might have got a particular grade. They were emailing, banging on doors, demanding people met with them in ways in which other students simply didn't. What came out of the other discussion groups, lots and lots of obviously difference across different students, was they would talk to each other, but already by this point they'd realised, or they felt, they didn't want to go and talk to academics, either because they'd been treated in very racist ways at school, or because they didn't think they were worthy of that level of support. So they were incredibly strategic about helping each other and developing other networks, but they didn't necessarily go and talk to academics in the same way that white students did. So when we presented the data, they disagreed. The Russell Group universities, particularly one, disagreed with it completely and said it could not be the case that the white students' data was so starkly different to what the other students were saying. And we said, but you randomly selected students for us to have in these focus groups. We didn't choose them, but they still disagreed with it. So we had to run the white focus groups again. And of course it said exactly the same thing again, and they refused to publish the findings, so I just wrote it up for a Canadian journal. I thought, well, take me to court, whatever. But I just think that goes to show how little understanding there is across some universities of what's really going on here. You know, there are real differences. These students are coming into higher educations with histories of quite racist practices in schools. I'm not allowed to share some of the findings from Monday's event around young Muslims, except to say that schools do not come out of that data well. And so these students are coming in with histories of things not being good for them. So it's not surprising that they're going to have particular problems in thinking about how they relate to academics, and I think we really need to recognise that. So there are all sorts of problems going on for these students. They've got all of these contested belonging boundaries between staff and students to students, this constant drawing of boundaries, campus practices that are really quite problematic, this need to constantly develop these different places in which they can develop a sense of belonging. And so there's all of those things about who they think they are. And this leads me to then think about, what does that mean to think you matter in higher education? Because if you don't think you belong, are you going to think you matter? So the next part of the research is to think through, what does it mean to think you may or may not matter to your particular university or to those around you? So mattering, the reason it's different to belonging, and I think it's an important difference, is that subjective perception that we make a difference to others. So that's why I'm saying you can develop a sense of belonging without believing that you've made a difference, or that somebody thinks you've made a difference in their world, or that you make a difference to them. And it fundamentally operates as a form of external validation in terms of who we think we are in relationship to other people. And it operates obviously at an individual level and at a community level. So a lot of the research that I've done recently has been looking at mattering and refugees, because refugees obviously not so much in places like Syria where you've got a civil war that really has obliterated a whole country, but quite often refugees have ceased to matter to those in authority because they've clashed for various reasons with people in authority. So you might have people who are journalists or teachers or doctors and so on. So having had a deep sense of connection in a community, there's a removal of that sort of connection, and they cease to matter, and that's part of the process of asylum as well. It's a very dehumanising process which actually compounds people's sense of not mattering. So that belief that you really are not making a difference to the world of other people, and that they're not making a difference to your world, is particularly significant for refugees, which is why I've used it in some of the work there, because it's about how we value ourselves, and it's one of the reasons why refugees find it particularly difficult to re-establish lives in a new country, because of that sense of no longer being of value. And it, again, like belonging, but in a very different, more affective, more deeply held and deeply rooted way, affects our sense of self and how we think about who we are in the world as people. And it also operates as a source of social integration. And so another reason why I think going to think about belonging in higher education, let's also include mattering, because that social integration, that hook that keeps students in higher education, comes from the sense of mattering more, I would argue, than it does from the sense of belonging. And it's about interdependence, and that's where it's significant, because it's not a one-way process. If we're going to make people feel that they matter, it's a two-way process. So we have to feel that we matter to them, and they have to feel that they matter to us. And there's something quite profound going on there. So you can superficially feel you belong, in that you're part of a social group. At the same time, you can feel that you also don't matter. But if you don't feel that you matter, you will never feel that you really belong. So the 4 elements that I'm looking at here with this data are attention, importance, dependence and appreciation. I'm starting to think whether we ought to add to that care, because I think there's something slightly different about the concept of being cared for and caring for other people, but I'm sort of still playing with that, so I'm not going to talk about it. I'll just leave you with that tease, and then you'll invite me back. So attention is that feeling that you are noticed by people. Now, I have quite particular views about distance learning that I'm not going to go into here, because I don't want to be critical of people who think it's a really good idea. But I think it's really difficult to be noticed at a distance. I think it's very difficult to be noticed when it's all online. I think it's very difficult to be noticed unless you're in the same room as people. So I think we've got to work doubly hard to develop that sense of attention if we're going to move into a world which has much more blended or distance learning, which is potentially likely to happen. What came out of the data here was that feeling about being invisible, and I think that's one of the areas which is particularly compounded when you are doing things at a distance, or being very visible. So you're either invisible or you're very visible, and it goes back to discourses around fundamentalism and migration. So Muslim refugees have 2 particular reasons why they're very visibly present in sort of discourse. What came out of the data as well is, particularly for some students and older learners, the feeling that they used to have attention and that it's been lost. And that sense of longing for the past was really strong in the data as well. And because of that, a real feeling of loneliness. There was a lot of discussion about being incredibly lonely, even when surrounded by people. And all of those things come together to make people really feel that loss of identity again. So again, I'm going to just put some quotes up. But it's quite interesting because I think these are even more stark than the ones about belonging. The idea of being a ghost came up a lot in the data, and it's come up a lot with people that I've interviewed for lots of different projects. That idea that you can both be present and be absolutely invisible at the same time, even when you're in the same room as other people. And that concept of invisibility was really strong and stark across the narratives. So the next area of mattering relates to importance, to whether we feel that we're important to other people and that they think we're of importance in return. So, no, that doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? I've put Bourdieu in because I'm an academic and I need to put in a dead French philosopher at least once in my slides, otherwise you might not think I'm a real professor. So there's Bourdieu. So it's that belief that you count to other people. That's what this is all about. But actually what came out of these narratives here was that people just weren't interested. There was no opportunity for anyone to really listen and to give the impression that they were interested in that individual student. Again, loss of status came out, particularly for people who were migrants. The idea of beginning again came out over and over, both with migrants and people who'd maybe gone into higher education. One quote that came out was about being so traumatised by the processes of school that it took years to actually think about coming back in again to any form of education. And then to then feel that you don't matter, I think is just awful. And then there's lots of implications about that importance, about how students, particularly mature learners, feel about themselves in relationship to their family. Because if they start to think that they're not important in higher education, there can be a sense of actually starting to doubt that sense of importance to other people. So again, I'll put some quotes up. It's a bit of a downer, this presentation, isn't it? You know, everything's going well. Sorry about that. So just with the previous slides, when I talked about people feeling that they were invisible, this same refrain came out of the data about that silencing and the ways in which people stop talking. Now, some of these students believed that the reason why people stopped talking was because they feel that other staff and students are deeply uncomfortable about talking about race. And I think that's true. I don't think we are anywhere near being racially literate so that we've got all staff and all students able and feeling comfortable to actually talk about race. And that goes to what you were speaking about earlier on. People panic about using the wrong terminology. They worry that they'll upset people. They think they don't know enough. And that's the sort of more positive side of it. Actually, they can talk in incredibly racist ways and in very, very dismissive ways about people's culture. So sometimes you've got students actually in environments where it just went silent, and other times there were the really problematic discourses as well. But other students didn't necessarily stand up to them, and staff didn't stand up for them. A lot of staff collusion in this, which is really problematic. So the next area that's important is to think about dependence and that interdependence, really. So a lot of students felt very strongly that they depended on others, but they never felt that others depended on them. And this is one of the problems that I've got with group work, because we often don't set it up properly for students to really understand the valuable role that they can play. And that's quite often why some students really struggle with group work, because they're not being worked with in a way that allows them to actually feel that their contribution will be something significant enough that other people have to depend on them. So I think we have to do an awful lot of work around group work to actually make sure that we're giving people opportunities to demonstrate their importance so that others will want to depend on them. And again, for these students, that idea of dependence and interdependence is really compounded by their histories of racism and discrimination. And they've learnt to behave in ways that actually protects them from further harm. But they still want to be needed. And it's a really difficult balance. And they want to be valued for the things that they're bringing to the classroom. And this is why, I'll come back in a minute, I think Yosso's work is so important, because they want to be recognised for what they bring rather than what they lack. So a couple more quotes again. Now, I want to make a point here that not all students have these experiences. So lots of students have a very positive experience of higher education, but they tend not always to be the students who put themselves forward to be interviewed. So I recognise that the data here is not necessarily representative of the overall black and minoritised ethnic community that is in higher education. But the reason why I use storytelling is because I think it allows people to make visible these sorts of incidences. And even if there were only 60 students across the whole of the population of higher education that were having these experiences, that's 60 students too many. I think this is common. I've yet to do a research project where I found much different, and where there are positive examples, they're quite isolated. So again, in the Muslim project that I'm talking about next week, across all of the data, there are probably 2 or 3 individuals who've said, actually, it's all been okay. And that's predominantly because they've been to private education and they've got highly educated parents. And those protective factors are actually very supportive. And where students don't have those things, it is much more like this data that comes out over and over again. So, final area, if I've counted up correctly, is appreciation, so that we care about people and we actually appreciate them for what they bring. And again, what came out of the data here was that they felt ignored, they felt rejected, they felt undervalued, and because of all of those things, again, they felt silenced. So, why does mattering matter? Well, if you don't matter, if you really feel you don't matter, then you're much more likely to be prone to anxiety and depression. And in higher education, it's got significant implications for retention of students and for their success. When we feel that we matter to others, we seek to try and please those. We want to actually perform well for those people because we have a sense of being valued. But when all of that is absent, unless you can really draw on inner resources and actually stick it out, it's very, very difficult to get through and persist when things are as difficult as they are. So I think there's some real implications for social justice in terms of us as academics, practitioners in higher education in other ways, for who we believe actually is entitled to be in higher education. Because if we can't create an environment in which all of our students feel that they matter, what we're actually saying is, we don't think some of you should be here, or that's the practice that we're actually facilitating. I do want to come back to this idea of agency and students being strategic, though, because the data is in danger of painting a picture of students being passive, and that is not the case at all. These students are highly strategic in terms of trying to work around and through these really significant exigencies of their lives. They develop new networks for support, and this is where I come to YOSO to think about them also sharing with each other and drawing on their community cultural wealth, or the capital that they actually possess, rather than the capital that perhaps higher education still expects students to possess. Now, I mentioned this last week, I think, when I was speaking, that one of my concerns about higher education is how fast it's diversified. And that's a really good thing. But we haven't diversified the staffing structures or the practices of higher education anywhere near as significantly as we've diversified the student population. So we've brought into higher education, we've created a system of significant student diversity, but a lack of real diversity of the rest of higher education. So I think we really need to start rethinking some of the things that we're doing. I think we have to start by thinking about the concept of mattering. I think it's really important. If we can think about those 4 areas, tension, importance, dependence and appreciation, and start to reframe whether we're working in outreach work and access work, transition into the first year, whether we're thinking about pedagogy, outcomes. If we rethink about our practices using those 4 areas, then we can actually start to think about, is what I am doing as this practitioner going to enable that person to believe that they're important? Is it going to make them feel that sense of having attention on them in a positive way rather than a negative way? So I think it's a helpful heuristic to start thinking about how we might want to shape practice across the piece, really, for higher education. But in terms of some specifics, I do think we need to start thinking about different networks that we're enabling people to actually access and develop. I think we have to do significantly more to actually enable people to develop positive peer relationships. We fall back constantly on the idea that we want students to be independent. We expect people to actually come into higher education with a particular set of skills. If we think about the histories of these students, it's asking a hell of a lot to say, just get on with it. I think we have to be more interventionist, and that's particularly so in terms of students' relationships with staff. It is not easy for some students to actually develop positive relationships with staff. And when you then compound that with some staff being both casually and overtly racist towards students, it's no wonder there's a significant lack of trust. We do need to help students think about themselves as successful higher education students, and that means creating pedagogies that allow them to rehearse that sense of identity. So not just being successful, but narrating that success. So giving them an opportunity to actually talk through their successful being as a higher education student. Of course, we need to think about our curricula. The problem we have at the moment is, again, there's very little empirical evidence that actually says if we do these things, it works. So, for example, the decolonisation of the curriculum, why is my curriculum white, that sort of discourse is probably really positive, but at the moment we don't know that it works. And actually where it's been put in place in South Africa, it's been quite problematic because no one quite knew what to put in its place instead. So I think we have to do some real careful looking at curriculum to think about how we actually decolonise it, but what we might put in its place. We also need to rethink time and tolerance and patience for some students. I worry, I genuinely, tremendously worry that ways in which we frame being in higher education is for the student to constantly be looking into the future. We're expecting our students to arrive already having that sense of where they're going. Our employability agendas seek to enable students to think into the future. But a lot of these students don't think like that. So if you think about it, and to just think about maybe socioeconomic background for a minute rather than anything to do with race or ethnicity. If you come from a family where you're paid weekly or you're on fortnightly benefits and your rent is paid in terms of a weekly pay, and you don't have any savings, and you maybe still use a meter that you're putting money in every day, and you haven't got a mortgage, and you don't plan for a holiday, your temporality, the way you think about time, is quite short. If you're a middle-class student from a particular sort of background, you will have a much longer ability of thinking about time. Your parents will have a 25-year mortgage. You'll always have been thought about in terms of the next steps, saving for next year's holiday, or thinking about. So I did a big research project looking at how students used extracurricular activities, and what came out of that was the ways in which a lot of students from quite privileged backgrounds used the most mundane extracurricular activities to actually be able to scaffold them to become the postgraduate employed person afterwards, in ways in which other students just didn't think about at all. So you might have two students doing bar work, for example, so some paid employment, or playing on a football team. So one student would say, but why would an employer be interested in this? The other student was able to narrate the idea of themselves as a successful postgraduate employed person and use that to think about their futures. I'm rambling, so I'm going to shut up in a minute, don't worry. So we need to think about time. Time is experienced differently by different sorts of students. We cannot have the same conceptualisation of time that we do, that's the dominant discourse around time. And we need to openly discuss race and religion. We cannot assume that people are confident enough to do it, and that's staff and students. And final slide. I think we should draw on Tara Yosso's work about community cultural wealth, and that's what I'm going to ask everyone to do in a minute. What Yosso's argued in working with women of colour in the States and community colleges is that we need to start with what students actually bring into the classroom and not what they lack, and to really start to understand the community cultural wealth, or forms of capital if you're going to go back to Bourdieu, that students may possess, but goes almost completely unrecognised in higher education. And so she talks about aspirational, linguistic, familial, social, navigational and resistance capital, and that's what I want us to have a conversation on in a minute. But I've been talking for far too long, so I'm going to pause there and see if anyone's got any questions. Thank you.
So, that's amazing. Thank you,
Jacqueline. Thank you very much.
Any questions before we move on to the workshop part of our programme? Isha, do we have the roving mic coming down to you?
No, thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was really interesting. Well, it's also depressing, actually, just reading those quotes. It's kind of difficult to believe such things are happening. You stated that you got quotes from those who came up with bad experience, but you also stated there were students with good experience, and their quotes isn't on those slides at the moment. And you also said that the reason being would have been because their good experience comes from either their parents are in higher education or they've been in private education.
Yeah, not all, but more likely.
More likely. I'm just curious how the doctor who, from Iran, I think it was, also had that negative experience. I'm just trying to find out what makes those Muslims with positive experience, gives them that confidence. What is it? Or is it their own personal life which says, I can't do this? I mean, I felt, being a child from both parents not being in higher education or educated anything beyond 16, I felt I wasn't good enough, and that fear I still carry. So sometimes I feel I'm a barrier to my own self from excelling, if you see what I mean. So I'm just wondering the psychology behind it, the two experiences, the positives and the negatives, if you can sort of share.
I think it's incredibly complex, and in a way, presenting any data like this is quite reductionist and not necessarily helpful, and it's one of the difficulties we have in terms of researching and writing up things that are really quite complex, because every single individual story could probably be a research paper because there's so much going on. Most of these students had internalised the idea that they were not good enough, and that either came from their early experiences, particularly whether they were educated in the UK or not, but students who were educated in the UK have still internalised the idea of not being good enough for all sorts of reasons. For students who then became migrants here, they're almost starting again from the bottom, and all of the things that they went through in school, they just start again. So they might do it in school, then they do it in FE, then they do it in HE, then they do it in work. And that thing that I was talking about in terms of belonging, and that having to constantly recreate that entitlement to be where you are, that's what you see a lot across the data. So you can have been in a situation where maybe you've been accepted, you feel that sense of entitlement, but there could be a rapid dislocation of your world through, for example, the processes of forced migration, and you're back at the bottom again, and you're starting all over again. So, and I think that's why particularly those from asylum-seeking backgrounds found it particularly difficult, because they had been successful. But most people who are working in the UK who've come from a refugee background are unemployed, underemployed, or they're doing unskilled, low-paid work. And yet, up until the Syrian crisis, where it is different, about 40% of refugees have either got higher education qualification or a professional experience, but that's not the world that they're doing. So if you look at somewhere like Sheffield, we run free English language courses in the community, and they are English for cleaners, for example. But the people doing those courses may well be doctors, but they can't practice as a doctor. So I think it's incredibly complex. But the one thing I would say about positive experiences, so family is really important, and family is incredibly supportive, and that probably doesn't come out of that presentation particularly well, but they can only be supportive as far as they're able to be supportive. But individuals in higher education make a difference, single individuals. And where we saw positive experiences, and they would be glimpses of positive experiences rather than my whole life has been wonderful type of experience, it was individual members of staff. And so it was someone who did sit down in a room with somebody and talk to them, and it wasn't dealt with via email. And actually made that face-to-face connection. Having a named person rather than student support services, that really makes a difference. So having people who teach in ways that allow their students to talk about their own histories, who are confident about dealing with potential racist conversations that might happen or comments, those people really make a difference, but they're not enough of them. And we have very few black academics. I mean, in this room, you're actually better represented. If you look at Sheffield Hallam, we're appalling. Is this being recorded?
Yeah.
Oh, we're not very good. But the sector is not very good. You know, it's a real problem across the sector. And of course, then, it's compounded by the fact that if we don't let our black and minoritised ethnic students get first and 2-1s, they won't become academics. So the whole thing, it's never going to change, because you can't do a PhD if you haven't got a first or a 2-1. If you haven't got a PhD these days, you probably can't get a job in academia. So we're just perpetuating that. And I think, so we need more staff from the communities that our students come from. And where they are there, they tend to be people that have more sympathies and more understanding. The problem is then they're used to represent the whole of the BME community, to sort of, exactly. And that's why we need a lot more of them. So, but anyway, that was a very, very long answer to say it's very complex. That's the short answer.
Melanie. Melanie, you're going to ask the next question. Then I've got a question as well, Jacqueline.
Okay.
I'd like to answer.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting, and I think you've articulated quite a lot of the things that I've come across in terms of some of the research that I've been doing. Really, I've got more sort of comments that I'm hoping you might be able to kind of comment back on. What struck me is from your kind of description of the experiences of those students is that what we're talking about here is institutional racism, and that it has to be recognised by the sector that we are an institutionally racist, sexist, we are institutionally discriminating against these students all the time. And what I found when I'm trying to challenge those things is that very often excuses are made, such as, well, it's because of what they've experienced at school. We can't do anything in higher education because, it's about their previous educational attainment, and so the focus comes back to the student. And what I really strongly believe is that institutions have to look at everything that they do in terms of their practices and their policies. So the students that you were talking about, in terms of their experiences, when I look at our own institution, we have a massive disproportionality in terms of the numbers of students that are referred for academic misconduct. And yet nobody is interested in looking at, well, why is this? Why are black and ethnic minority students being referred for academic misconduct? And very often the response that I get is, well, it's cultural. And I'm saying, I'm not talking about international students, although I have a problem about saying it's cultural in terms of international students. I'm talking about BME home students being referred for academic misconduct. And those kind of things that has to be looked at in the round in terms of those experiences. Those kind of things will impact on the experiences that those students have, and as you say, in terms of their belonging and mattering. If you're constantly referred for academic misconduct, how is that going to help in terms of your retention, achievement, etc.? So I think there's a real issue in the sector about recognising that we are institutionally racist, and we have to look at everything that we do in terms of how we impact on those students. And unfortunately, I'm not entirely convinced that the will is there. I actually think that given that the people who are in positions of power, very often white, very often male, don't recognise those experiences, and therefore there's no impetus to change it. Sorry, that's quite a depressing point, but I just, I don't know how we move that forward then from there.
I about 10 years ago, I was involved in the very first research project that was done, the Gender and Ethnicity Degree Attainment project that came out of, I think it was the DFE. And the piece of work that I did for that was to go ask every university in England or higher education institution in England whether they had any policy in place to address the degree attainment gap, and not a single one did. There is a slight difference now, and the gap hasn't closed much, but at least there is a sector impetus from HEFCE to make universities and offer look at this. So I think there's the possibility that change may be affected. One thing I would say in terms of evidence, if you need nothing else, I should have put it up actually, but in the HEFCE sort of where we're at, 2016, the latest HEFCE State of Higher Education one, there's a really excellent graph in there which shows the difference in degree attainment between white students and non-white students by what they come in with. So you can see if students come in with 4 A levels or equivalent at A grade, they're already going to have a gap. So it's and it goes all the way down. So if you come in with sub 80 UCAS points, and the gap's pretty consistent actually. And I use that quite a lot to talk internally or to talk to universities to actually say, it's there, you know, you can't explain it away. But that explaining away is absolutely fascinating because it's come up again and again and again. It's because they don't have the right qualifications and higher education, you know, they don't have the right... come out of school with the wrong qualifications. Let's look at this graph. No, they'll still get a worse degree. It's because language. No, these are home UK students, not international students. It's family. It's poverty. But the statistical analysis that was done in 2008 and was repeated again by HEFCE in 2012 has shown there's an ethnic penalty. You can talk all you like about poverty and family experiences of higher education and all of those things. And of course all of those things matter, but you will still come out with a worse degree if you're black than if you're not. And it's as simple as that. And I don't understand why the sector is not just truly appalled by that. If you turned it on its head and said, if you're a white male, you'll come out with a worse degree, I think we'd have done something about it before now. And that's not a popular belief. But in a university that will not be named, what I have experience of, I've been there 2.5 years now, and we're only just starting to do something really proactive and positive. It's got to be led by the top. It's got to be part of the VC's KPIs. It's got to be linked to performance-related pay for those who have performance-related pay. It's got to be an individual priority for every single member of staff. It can't be allowed to be anybody else's problem because it's all of our problems. So I think that's the only way we'll get really sustained and significant difference. And racial and religious literacy. We've got to be confident about talking about it. And the reason why we don't affect change is because we're not confident about talking about it in the first place. And that's the first thing that I think has to happen.
Yes, my question is, the word, you used a word in the beginning of your presentation that sends a shiver down my spine, resilience. So who defines resilience? And what right does anyone have for me to be resilient? Or why should they expect that of me? And why should I expect that of a student who's come to Europe on a boat across the Mediterranean, has arrived here, speaks 3 languages, maybe not mine, and who cracks and messes up in university, and I say, you're not resilient enough? Who's defining resilience?
Well, my big issue, as you know, with the concept of resilience is it's only thought about in a way that looks at deficits of the individual rather than the deficit of the external world that has failed to support an individual. And resilience is actually made up of our internal resources that are able to connect with and interplay with external protective characteristics. So if you don't have the external protective characteristics, you won't be resilient. Even if you believed in the concept and you wanted to be resilient and you didn't think it was... I mean, lots of people, like you say, we're not allowed to be mediocre anymore, are we? I quite like being mediocre, to be honest. But we all have to be... anyway.
Superman.
Yes. Yeah. Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman! We actually sang that last night. There's a great line in that song.
Yeah, let's not talk about last night. We're keeping last night quiet. I did say I wanted to come into the theme tune to Wonder Woman, but we decided it wasn't appropriate.
In your satin tights, fighting for your rights. No, that's one of the lines in that song.
Anyway, so why I find the concept of resilience problematic is because it allows all the responsibility to be put on students without actually accepting that we have to change our practices to create that environment within which people can be resilient. Yeah. And it just simply allows us to just say it's not our fault, it's not our responsibility. And it's the same with all of the stuff around grit, around character education, around all of those things, that it simply says that, but there's something wrong with you, And if you fix that, you'll be okay. And of course, I've ranted on about this. Cameron was a particularly problematic person, well, for hundreds and thousands of different ways, but in terms of character education, because he argued really strongly that if children have the right sort of character, they can overcome any form of structural disadvantage. So it doesn't matter whether you're brought up on a sink estate in the middle of God knows where. If you're struggling with life, you just have to develop a better sort of character and you'll be okay. And of course, what Cameron talks about in terms of character is a particular privileged public school version of what character might be, even if you accepted there was some truth in it. So what worries me is if you look at character education and if you look at things like mindset, and if you look at grit, all of those sorts of discourses are really pervasive in primary schools in the UK now. If you look at their things like their behaviour codes, it's all about, we just need to fix these kids. And if we can make them be better children, then they'll sail through all the disadvantages of life. So that lack of recognition of structural, profound, racist, structural disadvantage, poverty, inequality, if you don't recognise that, it's very easy to just say, well, just be a better person and you'll be okay. So, yeah, I'm ranting again now.
No, you're not ranting at all. So I love listening to you rant. Preeta?
I was the first international student on the Masters of Writing course, Sheffield Hallam. What I actually wanted to say was that you were talking about academics, I mean, from being in the classroom to student support services and all of that, changing their attitude towards students to make a difference. And from my experience, this difference can be made by an academic in the classroom, because often I find what Cal referred to earlier, sitting students around in a circle, getting people to share their experiences before you actually start your seminar, can be a very, very effective way of breaking down barriers. And I've found that with international students and home students as well from all diverse backgrounds, where there is isolation, and you as a teacher, practitioner, actually notice that there is isolation, the onus is actually on you to break that down. And that's what I find from my experience. So just like to know what you think as well.
I agree, absolutely. And it's why I'm interested in narrative pedagogies or pedagogies of narrative, because I think that's really important. I also think staff closeness to students is really important. And it worries me. I absolutely understand why you are going to be wherever this riverfront place is, whatever, all in big open plan offices, but it works against student success. I'm sorry, but it does. I understand the economics of doing that, but it's not helpful in our relationships with students if they cannot access us easily. Small group teaching works, we know that, and it's no great surprise. Of course, there are lots of other reasons why students in the Russell group are successful, but one of the reasons why their retention rates are really high is because that's how they operate. It's a model that works, and it really profoundly worries me that in the places where students are probably the most advantaged and the most privileged, they get in the forms of pedagogy and practice that they least need, and in the places where students need all of that most, because of all sorts of economic reasons why we have to do these things, we're distancing ourselves from our students, we're creating great big classrooms of really high numbers of students, we don't know who they are, close up and personal. You know, the best way to support students and to get them to stay in higher education, in my view, is close up and personal. And I think that's what works. Knowing our students, being able to relate to them, understanding their histories, being empathetic. We talked a lot about empathy last night when we weren't singing Wonder Woman. And, you can't be empathetic with your students if you don't know anything about them. How can you be? It's illogical. So I worry about...
And if you're not in touch with your own need for empathy.
Absolutely. And I worry about the boundaries that we're drawing up in the ways in which we are sort of separating staff from students. It worries me greatly. So, well, what we were going to do, but I'm not going to do because it's time for a break,
Coffee, yeah.
is in the pack, what I've done is I've taken Yosso's 6 areas of community cultural wealth and I've written up some reflective questions, and you can just take them away with you. They might be of no use whatsoever, but this is how I'm starting to try and think about my own practices, to use those 6 areas and start to think about, for example, one of the things that I really dislike in terms of the access and outreach work is the idea of aspiration raising, because I don't think we know much about people's aspirations, so it's quite pejorative to actually say we want to raise them when we don't know what they were in the first place. So there's something about what do we know about a student's aspirations? Well, if we don't know our students, we're not going to know their aspirations, so we make assumptions about them. And how are we enabling students to achieve their aspirations and not ours? And that can be quite different. What do we know about their linguistic capital? Do we know and value the fact that they come into the classroom speaking multiple languages? How do we help them tell their stories and so on? So I'm not going to go through all of these because it is time for a break, but I think just as we're thinking about mattering and maybe starting to reflect on our practices using those sort of 4 areas, I would also say I think Yosso's work is really helpful to help us think about our practice, and it doesn't matter what that practice is, whether you're somebody in student services or you're a teaching academic or a supervisor or a manager. I think we can use this sort of way of thinking about things.
Brilliant. Thanks again,
Okay,
Jacqueline.
thank you.